As far as I remember, we're up to John chapter 19, verse 17.
Yep.
And right to you.
I think. Yeah. We finished the trial before Annas, the power behind the throne,
Yep.
or behind the high priest, and Caiaphas gets such a small mention, and yet that's what the other Gospels concentrate on, the defense where Jesus said that they were going to see him coming on the clouds of power with the angels of God. And all that it says in 18 is, so Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest, and then a few verses later, from Caiaphas, Jesus was led into the governor's headquarters, and it was now early morning. So I was thinking about how Jesus he was not in the best physical condition by any means. He'd been mocked by the people at the Sanhedrin and at Annas' house, and being kept awake and led from place to place until finally they bring him up before Pilate. And then John concentrates, it seems to me, on what goes on before Pilate. We wouldn't know very much about what went on there apart from John.
Why do you think that is? Why does John focus on Pilate? Because the others hadn't, or because there was something particularly important that he wanted to highlight about Pilate and maybe even the response of Rome to Jesus?
I think absolutely. Yeah, I have to keep remembering that John, when he wrote this gospel, was already sent from Jerusalem by the rest of the apostles to be a sort of the apostle to the dispersion, to the Jewish citizens of Rome who were spread out over the empire. And to start with, they were the most important group because Jesus was Jewish and he was the Jewish Messiah. But very quickly, mainly St. Paul coming into that, but the Gentiles very quickly outnumbered the Jews. But at the first, that would have been an important decision that the other apostles are made to send Peter and John to go to the Jewish Roman citizens. So I suppose they've got an interest in how the Christian faith and its Jewishness intersected with Rome. That was pretty important to them. And there's what you get from reading this thing is that the Romans were dead keen to, or well, at least Pilate was dead keen to set Jesus free and had nothing against him whatsoever, that it was entirely a choice by the Sanhedrin and the high priest that they were going to get rid of Jesus. That was the reason Jesus was crucified. And I think it's really important that in what went on between Pilate and the Jews and Pilate and Jesus, Pilate saw that Jesus went a lot further than what the Jews had in mind for the Messiah, and vaguely grasped what I think Jesus was saying when he said, "My kingdom is not from this world," and that his purpose in coming into the world was to witness to the truth. and that everyone who was not deaf to truth would hear his voice. And that's precisely what the Jews in the dispersion needed to hear, that there was the rejection by Israel was simply by their narrow-minded failure to see what God was doing. And yeah, I think that trial before Pilate makes that very, very clear.
Was it also possibly a bit of an apologetic for the Gentiles that they're starting to connect with a lot as well? Because isn't some part of what Paul, the sort of the history laid out in Acts, is also a bit of a apologetic for the legality of Christianity?
Yeah. Yeah. That was all changed by Nero in the 60s, 64. So that's probably, yeah. Does that have a bearing on when John was written, that it was written before that persecution by Nero? Not hard to say, but there's so much irony there. The Jews force Pilate to do what they want done to Jesus. They want him crucified, and in forcing him to do that, although he's trying very, very hard to release Jesus, even doing things that, like having him flogged, like it says at the start of chapter 19, and then bringing him out to the Jews in order that they might think, he'd suffered enough. Yeah, as I've read that through a few times, I got the impression that the Jews have shown their hand very clearly by, well, they did. They said, we have a law, and by that law he must die because he's claiming to be Son of God, even though he's a man. I've lost my thought. Anyway, by the end of that trial, the Pilate is saying that Jesus is their king, and making it very clear that from his point of view, they were misjudging Jesus completely. And he finally gets them into the position where they acknowledge that they have no king but Caesar, which was not the kind of thing that the Jews wanted to say.
Well, it's completely the opposite to what they would normally say.
Yeah.
Normally say God is our king.
Yep.
Well, that's what they should say. And it seems that they so much don't want this to be true that they would do anything to sort of maintain their position of power, even faced with God himself coming to visit them and reveal his truth and the wonder of his love for them. They would rather have that side and maintain the status quo.
Yeah. Does it mean really for all of their ritual and ceremony, the temple, the whole service and everything that went on to sort of acclaim Yahweh, the God of the Jews and the God of the universe, that they really didn't believe it. Yeah. They were
Their power and their rituals and the comfort of the systems that they had in place.
They had worked out how things worked, and they wanted to just maintain the status quo because it allowed them to just focus on what they wanted for themselves, and that was it. Yeah. I wonder if that's true, Lucas, even for us. Accepting that there is a God, just that makes an awful difference on how you live life. And then add to that the thought that one day we're going to face him and have to give an account of ourselves. That's a pretty terrifying thought. And then to have actually learned of the love of God that we're looking at here in a way that's just completely, how do you get your mind around the fact that the Word that became flesh, who had created the universe and who maintained life moment by moment by moment, was here being handed over to be crucified? You know, if God has shown this much of an interest in us and bringing about our reorientation to the truth of his existence, if we really believe that, we have to live differently. We can't, it seems to me, what the Jews were doing back then, and I think like the temptation for us is to do now, is to say, well, it's a hope and maybe it's true, but we better just be practical and get on with life and make sure that we've got everything in order for our own existence here and now, rather than thinking of the big picture of what God has in mind. I think I find that temptation in myself. Although this morning when I was praying and thinking, and I was trying to keep in mind that the person that John had talked about in the prologue, the Word became flesh, that and what Jesus himself had said here now, when Pilate went and had that talk with him, my kingly authority comes from elsewhere. You are a king, then, said Pilate. Jesus answered, King is your word. My task is to bear witness to the truth. For this was I born, for this I came into the world. And all who are not deaf to truth listen to my voice. Well, out of that, one thing is very sure, that we ought not to be deaf to truth. But Jesus' point is to bring the perspective of that first chapter of John, the prologue, to us now, and to accept that what Jesus did by, he's been talking about his hour hadn't come, and that the time was ripe when God's glory would be shown. I'm having real trouble trying to keep my mind fixed on the claims that Jesus made and the confidence that he showed right up to this point. Even at this point, the confidence that he's showing when he talks to Pilate and said, you had no authority over me at all if it had not been granted to you from above, and therefore the deeper guilt lies with Caiaphas for handing me over to you. Yeah, his confidence, and then the point of the suffering being for our sake to bring about the reconciliation with God. It underlines it in very indelibly that it took a huge effort to bring about our redemption, for the world to be saved from sin.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll keep going then with chapter 19.
Okay.
Verse 17 in chapter 19.
Yeah.
Jesus was now taken in charge and, carrying his own cross, went out to the place of the skull, as it is called, or in the Jewish language, Golgotha, where they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on the right, one on the left, and Jesus between them. And Pilate wrote on the inscription to be fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. This inscription was read by many Jews because the place where Jesus was crucified was not far from the city, and the inscription was in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Then the Jewish chief priest said to Pilate, you should not write King of the Jews. Right, he claimed to be King of the Jews. Pilate replied, what I've written, I've written. It's worth sort of commenting on that little section, because that's pretty strongly connected to the rest of what that interaction with Pilate. It's sort of the finishing point of that interaction with Pilate.
The Jews had forced Pilate to do what they wanted him to do, to hand Jesus over to be crucified. Pilate had said, I find no charge against him. He's innocent. Which is a little bit ironical that he had him flogged in an effort to get them to be sort of sympathetic towards him, but justice must
probably
be
a reflection. Yeah, probably a reflection of the brutality of the times as well, though.
I think so. But in this case, I think Pilate has the last word. And if you think of John writing his gospel amongst the Gentiles, it's an affirmation that we Christians make. This Jesus that you've crucified is Lord and King. So, yeah, I think it's John has put triumph here just in the final word from Pilate. And the Jews didn't like it. I guess their conclusion was that he did only claim to be King of the Jews. But Pilate is giving his judgment that he really was their king. He said that. What shall I do with your king? We have no king but Caesar, they shouted.
Was it fairly standard sort of procedure to write notices in 3 different languages?
I don't know. It was a multilingual society. Greek was kind of the natural language, but then they spoke Aramaic. The Jewish population naturally, and then the Romans would be, I imagine, talking Latin amongst themselves. But yeah, it's probably significant that that Pilate wrote in the 3 languages. he's wanting to make it very, very clear that his conclusion is to everybody, to the Greeks, to the Jews, and to the Romans. Again, I see maybe there's something there with John just wanting to make that notice that even the Romans had the message that Jesus was King of the Jews.
It reminds me a bit of in Mark's gospel, how right throughout his gospel, all the people who should get it and who should understand who Jesus is, they don't get it. All the people that shouldn't get it, like the poor people, the demons, they can all see who Jesus is. Even the Roman centurion at the end, they get it, but other people can't see it. And it's actually a pretty powerful literary device for helping you as a reader to enter into the story and grapple with what's going on. Like sort of shouting, I can see you, but no one else can see.
Yeah. I found that myself when I was reading Mark from the point of view of rhetorical criticism. And I felt by the end of reading Mark's gospel that I had to join those simple kind of disciples who were following Jesus and talking about him, just on the grounds that he needed somebody better to represent him than the official representatives.
Because the disciples don't really get it in Mark, do they? They're slow to learn.
Yeah.
Over and over again. Yeah. So then the next section here, from verse 23, the soldiers, having crucified Jesus, took possession of his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier, leaving out the tunic. The tunic was seamless, woven in one piece throughout, so they said to one another, we must not tear this, let us spots for it. And thus the text of Scripture came true. They shed my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. It's interesting there, like I've sort of skipped over that bit, but it's verse 17, went to the place of the skull where they crucified him, sort of just 3 words. They crucified him there in verse 18. Obviously, a horrendous way to die. Doesn't really give much. There's not much focus on that as an event, but we do know historically that it was a pretty awful process.
Yeah.
And hard to comprehend. Jesus submitting to that, who he is.
I guess that's quite interesting, really, that it was a brutal thing to do. And you can imagine, well, when it's put on cinema, it really does become quite a brutal thing to see. I remember watching the what was it called? The
Passion of the Christ.
Yeah, the Passion of the Christ. That really was moving, just to see the flogging and crucifixion and the suffering. Yeah. Why isn't more made of it here? Probably because it doesn't need to be. The essential thing is that a sacrifice was made that reconciled humanity with God. That really...
I mean, he's writing to people in a world who would have been familiar with the ways of the Roman sort of the machinery of the Roman army and the sorts of things that they did, crucifixion wouldn't have been foreign to people. And for us, it takes a bit of creative thinking to comprehend how awful it is. For people back then, they would have been familiar with it, I imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, I imagine that it is the answer. It didn't need to be sort of done in Technicolor. Maybe there's a little bit of trying to save Jesus from embarrassment. No, that's not quite right. But I mean, it's a holy thing that God become flesh was actually held down onto a cross and nailed there. If you look, stand back and see, this is God's creation doing this to the Creator God who made them. It's a solemn, well, solemn is not the right word. It's a horrible thing to contemplate. And the sooner you get it over and done with, the better, you know. The less detail seems to be a little bit more fitting. Yeah.
Yeah, but how to grapple with the gravity of it all, like you just said. You know, like the Creator, the Word who became flesh. Yeah, having nails driven through his feet and hands. Yeah, it is extraordinary. And then I suppose the thing that made me think of that was probably the indignity of having the soldiers divide his clothes amongst them and then cast lots over who's going to get the undergarment. It's like, this is what it's come to. This is what Jesus' life has come to. There probably is only surviving earthly possessions. He has absolutely nothing. And they're just sharing them amongst each other. And yeah, it's just, I suppose it's just like it sort of hits you in the face a bit that if he is really who he says he was, then there's nothing left.
Terrible.
Yeah.
That's right. The wonder is, why doesn't he give up on us? That's my kind of response, I suppose. Wow, Lucas, what does that really mean? He didn't give up on us. In spite of that happening, he continued with God's plan to bring about a reconciliation and to forgive us, to forgive the whole human race. Well, it shows to me, from our point of view, we're just not worth it. But then it makes us see, from God's point of view, he must think it is worth it. I had a funny experience while I was praying this morning. I was just thinking of the love of God. I had actually been thinking about who it was who was crucified, that this was, before time began, the Word who was with God and through whom all things came to be. And thinking, okay, you died for me. I think a little bit of that thought of, you must think it's been worthwhile, God, to have done that so that I am accepted as your child. And I battle a lot with thinking I'm worthwhile. I think we all do a little bit. And especially worth God's love. And I just, a funny feeling came to me as I was praying. I am going to believe this. Nothing is going to stop me believing this, because it's true that the love of God has shown itself in the death of Jesus Christ. Yeah, just that. It's not because I'm worth anything that I'm going to claim to be loved by God, but it's because of what he's worth and what he's demonstrated in love, that I'm going to refuse to believe that he doesn't love me, that he doesn't.
Then you're free.
Yeah.
You're free to become all that he dreams and longs for you to be.
Yeah. And to know that it's not a once and for all thing, but this is a reality that is continually being renewed. I might not live up to my own expectations, but in the long run, it doesn't matter, as long as I have in my heart this commitment to follow him, to make him, to hold him up as my God and my Saviour, which he is. Yeah.
That's probably a good place to finish.
Yeah. I need to go and cry a bit.
That's good.
Bless you.
Thanks, Laurie.
Sorry to be a mess this morning.
That's all right.
Yeah.
You're sick. You can't help it. The Lord knows.